The world's greatest mysteries of science and history. You're watching the MHS Network.
In the world of Christianity, there exist many testimonies of miracles and many sacred relics. However, for some, the Shroud of Turin stands out above all else in regards to its authenticity and its witness to the resurrection of Christ. For those who don't know, the Shroud of Turin is believed by many to be the burial cloth of Jesus Christ. On the shroud is depicted the image of a man, with markings that seem to be consistent with injuries from crucifixion. The shroud has a long history. According to Britannica.com, it first emerged historically in 1354, was used as an object of devotion, and was later damaged by a fire and water in 1532. The shroud now resides in the Cathedral of Turin, where it is preserved and only displayed on occasion. The first question that comes to mind when one first examines the shroud is, how was the image on the shroud made? In 1978, a team of American scientists traveled to Turin, Italy in an attempt to answer this question. Their investigation into the shroud remains the most in-depth study ever done, taking place from October 8th through the 13th. The research concluded that no pigments, dyes, or stains had been found on the fibrils of the shroud. The shroud also contained unique three-dimensional information, as well as determining a similar type of change in linen that can be obtained by sulfuric acid or heat. However, there are no chemical or physical methods known which can account for the totality of the image, nor can any combination of physical, chemical, biological, or medical circumstances explain the image adequately. The summary concludes with this, quote, "We can conclude for now that the shroud image is that of a real human form of a scourged, crucified man. It is not the product of an artist. The bloodstains are composed of hemoglobin, and also gives a positive test for serum albumin. The image is an ongoing mystery, and until further chemical studies are made, perhaps by this group of scientists or perhaps by some scientists in the future, the problem remains unsolved." A hypothesis was developed, however, to possibly explain how the image was imprinted onto the cloth. That hypothesis being that an intense burst of vacuum ultraviolet radiation emitted from every three-dimensional point of the body in the shroud. According to a document titled Science in the Shroud of Turin from Robert J. Spitzer, quote, "Vacuum ultraviolet radiation is an excellent candidate for explaining the shroud image because VUV radiation would not have scorched the cloth. It dissipates so quickly that its initial energy could discolor the cloth in a brief burst without scorching or destroying it in the process. Furthermore, vacuum ultraviolet radiation could be limited to the surface of the fibrils without penetrating to the medulla of the fibers." What are some other aspects of the shroud that draw our attention? An obvious one are the injuries depicted on the shroud, consistent with injuries Christ received before and during his crucifixion. For example, the marks on his back from the scourging, head wounds from the crown of thorns, the wound in his side, the nails that pierced his hands and his feet. What makes this even more interesting is that according to Elvio Carolino, a researcher at the Institute of Crystallography in Bari, Italy, as well as other experts, the cloth contains nanoparticles which are not typical of the blood of a healthy person. In fact, the blood on the shroud contains high levels of creatinine and ferritin, which are substances found in patients who suffer forceful traumas like torture. Details like this, I believe, point to a more authentic view of the shroud as being the true burial cloth of Christ. Another factor that points to the shroud's authenticity is when examined by Michael Marks, he noticed what appeared to be coins on the eyes of the man depicted on the shroud. He saw the letters UCAI, consistent with coins minted by Pontius Pilate in 29 AD. Such details would be unlikely, in my opinion, if this were the work of an artist. But in light of so much evidence, why do some doubt the legitimacy of the shroud? There are many reasons. One of the main ones is due to the carbon dating done on the shroud in 1989. 3 different labs took samples from the shroud and indicated that it was from around the 1300s. However, many have noticed points of issue with this dating. In fact, according to a study from Raymond Rogers on this testing that was conducted, quote, "The combined evidence from chemical kinetics, analytical chemistry, cotton content, and pyrolysis mass spectroscopy proves from the material from the radiocarbon area of the shroud is significantly different from that of the main cloth. The radiocarbon sample was thus not part of the original cloth and is invalid for determining the age of the shroud." The paper from Robert J. Spitzer provides further context. Quote, "As noted above, the 1988 carbon-14 testing showed that the fibers removed from the shroud were 638 years old, with a probable origin at around 1350. Note that this test did not show that the shroud originated in 1350 AD, but only that the fibers extracted from the shroud, which could have come from the threads or cloth used to mend it after the fire of Chambéry in 1532. As we shall see, the fibers removed from the shroud were probably not from the original shroud, but from dyed cloth added to the shroud at that time. Furthermore, the testing did not account for microbiological contaminants or the additional carbon that would have been added by the fire. These problems indicate that the 1988 carbon-14 testing was very likely invalid and skewed toward a much later date. In summary, it seems that the testing sample used from the shroud could have possibly been a repair added to the cloth in the aftermath of the damage it received over the years. And due to samples being taken from the same location on the shroud and not different locations, as well as the fact that additional carbon from microbiological contaminants were not removed from the shroud before the carbon test was conducted, it became easier to overlook the late dating of the cloth. Another examination of the shroud that sheds doubt on the carbon dating is the pollen grain study done by Max Frey, a Swiss botanist and criminologist. By using adhesive tapes during the 1978 Stirp investigation, he determined that out of the 58 pollen grains discovered on the shroud, 45 were from sedimentary layers from 2,000 years ago near the area of the Sea of Galilee. Even more interesting is that 13 of the pollen grains found are unique specifically to Israel. Furthermore, many believe that the shroud was kept and displayed in Constantinople for a period of time before it was sacked in 1204. This not only would suggest an older age of the shroud, but would also explain why the shroud didn't officially surface until much later in history. A Crusader knight named Robert de Clary made note of an item appearing to be the shroud in Constantinople. Quote, "Among these there is a church called St. Mary of the Blackenay, where the shroud was kept in which our Lord was wrapped. Every Friday it was elevated all straight, so that it was possible to easily see the image of our Lord." Also, according to a study from Giulio Fentia and Claudio Furlan of the University of Padua, micro-gold particles were in fact found on the shroud, which could have come from the shroud coming into contact with gold coins from the Byzantine Empire. To top it all off, a recent peer-reviewed study using wide-angle X-ray scattering to study the natural aging of the cellulose from the shroud is suggesting that the shroud could possibly be in fact 2,000 years old. This study came from Liberato De Caro of Italy's Institute of Crystallography of the National Research Council in Bari. I will leave a link in the description box for more information on this peer-reviewed research that was conducted. In light of all this information, it is my personal opinion that the Shroud of Turin is in fact the authentic burial cloth of Jesus Christ, his image being imprinted upon the cloth upon his resurrection by the divine light that emanated from his body, the same light that engulfed him on Mount Tabor during his transfiguration, the same divine, uncreated light of God.